On to segment 3, why it matters. Again from Left Turn. Until a half a dozen years or so ago, I was largely a media effects non-believer. Like many other social scientists, I found it difficult to believe that voters could be systematically fooled into thinking and voting against their natural tastes and values. I have since abandoned those views.
I'm a media effects believer now.
Why?
You know what happened on Stanford campus, maybe 200 yards where we sit right now. I was at a conference here on the media, and it was in between sessions. I was talking to this guy. I wasn't even thinking about our conversation. I was about to give my presentation, a little nervous. And this guy's named Stefano Della Vigna. He's a economics professor at Berkeley. I thought he's a grad student. I wasn't really listening to him. And then all of a sudden he started telling me about this a natural experiment that he was going to do. He was going to look to see where he and his co-author looked to see where Fox News entered in the late 90s. Now you think, oh, Fox would like to enter conservative markets. Well, it turns out that's not quite true. In the late 90s, they really didn't have much choice where to enter. They had to make these deals with cable providers like AT&T, and AT&T didn't pick markets according to political beliefs. So it was almost like an experiment. You know, it was almost random, the markets they would enter. And he said, we're going to look to see how people vote. Does this change how people vote? And I told him, I said, well, you know, I'm a media effects agnostic. Your study is going to decide how I believe.
In other words, before Fox News is available in a given market, you would, if media has an effect, you would expect people to vote in a certain way.
Right.
And then after Fox News becomes available, you might see a difference in the voting pattern.
Right.
That's basically the experiment.
Right. It's a little more than that because well, you could say, oh, well, George Bush, it was the difference between the 2000 election and 1996 election. So you have to say, well, George Bush did a little bit better than Bob Dole.
Right.
But on average, he did something like 4 points better. And then the question was, did the people in the Fox News areas do a little bit better than that 4%?
I see.
And Della Vigna and his co-author found exactly that it really did affect. People did vote slightly more conservative.
Okay, now on to a gigantic claim, maybe the most arresting claim in Left Turn. Quote, now we just talked about a little experiment in a few cable TV markets. Fox News on its best day still only has 2 million viewers, but listen to what Tim Groseclose contends. Quote, my results suggest that media bias aids Democratic candidates about 8 to 10 percentage points in a typical election. I find, for instance, that if media bias didn't exist, deep breath, then John McCain would have defeated Barack Obama 56 to 42 instead of losing 53 to 46. Oh, come on. How can you know such a thing? How can you know such a thing?
I have to admit, there's a lot of assumptions. There's
well, take us through it. Take us through it.
The whole idea partly is to try to come up with an aggregate measure of media effects, and I have something that I call the media lambda. And here's the idea. So I'm going to need my hands to
go ahead.
Explain
I'll
this.
Get out of the way.
So the idea is if the media slant is here, and by my measure, its average slant quotient is about a 58, including everything, talk radio, cable TV, everything, which is about 8 points left of center. And I say, well, okay.
Hold on. Let's get the methodology right because it's of the essence of this book. This book is important because you go at things methodologically. How do you compare the effect of Rush Limbaugh? How do you weight a Rush Limbaugh against, say, a New York Times?
Okay.
Rush Limbaugh has so and so many listeners. The Times has so and so many readers. How do you weight that?
It all came from a Gallup survey that asked people, where do you get your news? And so from the survey,
so you weight them purely by numbers of listeners or readers. Is that right?
Well, it's how they reported where they get their news.
Okay.
So it was an actual audience share, and you got to be careful because if it's audience share, there's some people who are watching TV while doing the dishes.
Right.
So I think it's better to use this recall measure where people say where they get their news. So that's what that's based on.
All right. So get us now to this huge margin in favor of Democrats.
So the PQ of Rush Limbaugh, I think, was something like a 5 or 10, very conservative, right? PQ of national newspapers is something like 65 or 70. Do a big weighted average of all that, and I get about 58.
Okay.
Which is left of center, but not that left of center. Remember, a Joe Lieberman speech is
74,
right? So if that's where the media is, if the media is at 58, and we know the average voters is about 50, and what I posit in this is that, well, let's have a simple model. Let's assume that the average voter has two forces tugging on him. The media, which may be pulling him to the left, and his natural views, which may be to the right. And so if the media really can pull us to the left, as this Della Vigna study showed, or, has an effect, then what that means is that 50 PQ that we see in the average voter is artificial. It's been pulled a little bit to the left, and we don't know how far. And I said, well, let's assume that there's two forces pulling on it. There's the natural views, which we don't know where they are, but they're pulling this way, the media's pulling this way, and they're somewhere in the middle. Through looking at some of these academic studies measuring the aggregate effect of the media, I find what I call the media lambda. It says that the effect of the media is about 7/10 of those forces. The effect of your own natural views is only 3/10 of those forces. Okay, so that's a bold statement. It says the media has more of an effect on us than things like our parents, our DNA, or upbringing. Okay, but if that's true, that if here's the natural views, here's where the 50 that we see, here's the 58, the natural views have to be 7/10 of the distance here. So from there, it's just an algebra problem to say what is that number.
But this notion that the media has more of an effect on us, that it's nurture, so to speak, rather than nature, and that the nurture is being done by the Sulzberger family that owns the New York Times, for example. Are you positing that? That sounds like something that's harder to measure in and of itself. That's a derivative measurement of a derivative measurement of how solid is it?
That's a fair point. And but it all comes from these three academic studies that I look at. So I look to see, for instance, that Della Vigna study. So they are actually able to look in these Fox News neighborhoods and say this, and I can say, well, the slant quotient changed about 0.9 points.
Because of the presence of Fox. The average slant quotient of all media in those neighborhoods, okay.
And then we could say, okay, how did the political quotient change? We could look at actual election results to compute that. And that was about 0.85, something like this. So I can say you change the slant quotient, something like 0.9 or 0.95. The political quotient will change something like 0.8 or 0.85. The ratio of that is something like 0.8. I average 3 of these studies to say 0.7 is about my estimate of exactly.
So every time you go at it, and you go at it as systematically and objectively and as quantitatively as you can, you come up with the result that the media is dragging the country to the left, and substantially so.
Right.